Okay, thank you everybody so much for coming to our annual event. At the Center for Urban Economics and Real Estate at Sauder, we try to maintain a strong relationship with the community here. We've got so many friends in the real estate industry, affiliated government consulting, lending, and it's always nice to try to put on a good dialogue. We do it every year, an event, find an issue that we think is engaging for people. And you have the opportunity to schmooze, network, hopefully learn something, so we really appreciate it. Speaking of appreciating it, unceded territory of Musqueam, Squamish, Swaleltooth, and that's something I wanted to acknowledge. I also want to acknowledge one person who puts this together every year, which is Jesse Lamb of Sauder, who just, this is not easily done. I can assure you that if I were in charge of this, we'd be eating crackers in the rain, and we're not, and for that we have to thank Jesse Lamb. We should also thank our hosts who provide support, GROSVENOR, year in and year out. So thank you very much to you for the generous support that makes this event possible. Finally, I have three excellent students out who are either from government and business class or what do we call it, real estate finance class, and that is Nabil Sahali, Iana Shakarova, and Damir Alexandrov. So thank you very much to our student volunteers. Speaking of students, we have really good students. Many of you are alumni, and keep hiring those alumni, please. We try to provide a both intellectually engaging and relevant education, and doing outreach like this helps with the relevant part. By engaging with the community, hopefully Sora and I learn something about what's actually happening and how to link that back into the classroom. Speaking of which, I would like to bring up Sora to talk about some of the work he's doing, and there's a lot to make our student experience better. So let me turn the stage over to my fine colleague, Sora Somerville.
Tom, thanks a lot. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout. First of all, I'm going to say all these things about the wonderful things that we do for the students. All current and former students who know that I may be exaggerating are not allowed to say anything about it and should just nod their heads and sort of agree that we're doing wonderful things. It was really interesting. So at Sauder, there's this sort of reevaluation of the BCom program. It's sort of, what are we doing in the BCom program? What do students need today? So obviously we have a group that should be working on this for about 27 years, and then we'll go through the university process, which will take another 12 years because universities work slowly. But one of the things that was really striking is the notion that they've been very, very excited by experiential learning. And all of a sudden, this is something we're all going to have to worry about in the classroom and various things. And so the problem, of course, with academia is they give names to things, and you never really know what they're talking about, right? There's some name. So I asked about what this was, and it turns out it's everything that we've been fortunate enough to be able to do in the real estate program at Sauder, and we've been able to do this because of just really great support from former students and from industry. And looking at what we're doing in terms of the internship program that we have for students, the NAIOP case competition where students work for 3 months on a development site, usually in Seattle, and really sort of get up to speed with understanding development. Partnerships that we have with industry that let us in the real estate investment class and the development class have the students work on real sites rather than just sort of some imaginary thing that I made up. And even right now in November, we're hosting a case competition here with 17 schools from around the globe coming here for a real estate case competition. And again, sort of all these different ways that thanks to partnerships, we're able to introduce our students to both sort of a more theoretical construct that Tom and I know, but also real stuff that we don't know very much about whatsoever. I just wanted to be able to come up here and say thank you, because without the help of both former students and alumni, the industry, and other interested parties, whether it's politicians, government people, NGOs, we've really benefited, whether it's guest lectures or just assistance, because it's not just sort of an industry academic partnership, it's also a partnership with a lot of other entities. You know, when I want to talk about social housing, having people come into my development class and talk about how how you develop social housing is really, really important. And we've really benefited from that. And so I want to, highlight that for those of you who don't know about it, because what we're trying to do at the center is really try to find a way to, have 3 feet, right? 1 foot in education, 1 foot in research, or 1 foot in policy and engagement with the community. And Tommy, you're busy tweeting this right now so that it's going out to the world in real time? Excellent. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm really looking forward to this evening.
Trying to crib, we had some very good questions from the audience that come ex ante. But then during the talk as well, you've got cards, so if questions come to you, bring them to me, and I will try to quickly synthesize them to ask on the fly, which is harder than it looks. Tonight we're going to talk about rental housing. Just in the air, one senses there's a switch in supply from condo towards rental. And I brought together a panel to discuss that. One member of the panel sends her apologies, Ann McMullen of the UDI, unfortunately not able health-wise to join us tonight, but we have an excellent panel, and I don't think I have walk-on music, but I'll do a very brief introduction to our 4 surviving panelists who can then come up, and I'll discuss a little bit about why each of them is here. I guess I'll go in speaker order. David Hutniak from Landlord, BC, is somebody who almost oozes gravitas. I think a lot of credibility is somebody who's interested in doing well by doing good, so bringing landlords together, to behave in a professional, positive way, but of course advocate for interests. And so that's David Hutniak of Landlord, BC. Our second speaker is going to be Tony PAPPAJOHN, a local developer. You cannot live on the west side and be unaware of some of the work he is doing. An early adopter of rental incentives. He's got a very interesting project on 2nd and Larch, and another potentially very large one and very interesting on Broadway. So I thought it would be very interesting to bring Tony along, somebody who's been interested in advancing the understanding of the need for diversity of housing options to make Vancouver a more diverse place. So Tony PAPPAJOHN, glad to have you. Our third speaker will be Khelsilem from the Squamish community, doing very interesting work around Vancouver, as you may know. They control a site with really limited need for government approval around the Molson factory, and it'll be most interesting to see what happens there. Just a really very interesting, both a sort of deregulated but also community-oriented rental project. So I thought he would be something very interesting to join us. So Khelsilem, thank you. Finally, as an academic, I think we learn from creative disagreement. And so looking at the panel, and if UDI was represented as well, it would have been, a big cheering section for more supply, more supply. So I reached out, I Googled, who's the most NIMBY city councilor in Greater Vancouver, and I emailed all of them. Only one of them got back to me, and they said, I can't make it, but who you should really bring up is Josh Gordon. So Josh has done a lot of work from Simon Fraser, studying the impact of outside demand on our market, and has been an outspoken voice on the subject of demand, with a little bit of a skepticism of, is really supply the problem? So I think he'll be a very interesting voice to join us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over sequentially to the speakers for 5 to 8 minutes each of uninterrupted. What's their message that they want to send about rental housing policy and prospects? I'll try and listen for agreement, disagreement. We'll do some synthesis, and then we'll turn to pre-audience questions and just scribble down questions on the fly, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. Thank you. With that, David Hutniak.
It's working. I'm actually going to read what I wanted to say tonight, so I hope you'll bear with me, but I wanted to ensure that I get everything out there, so like I said, please bear with me. It is generally agreed that today, British Columbia, and in particular the province's large urban centers, is challenged by a rental housing supply and unaffordability crisis. Understanding that approximately 1/3 of British Columbians live in rental housing, the magnitude of this current rental housing crisis is widespread and negatively impacts the province's entire economy. In April of this year, Landlord BC published a report entitled Understanding BC's History of Rent Controls and the Tax Policy to Improve Today's Rental Housing Crisis. The purpose of this report, as the name implies, was to analyze the history of rent controls and tax policy to understand how the province came to be challenged by the rental housing crisis now impacting British Columbia, and what lessons can be learned from this history to improve the rental housing environment today and into the future for the benefit of all British Columbians. While it is widely claimed that the vast majority of purpose-built rental housing was constructed due to tax benefits prior to the mid-1970s, our report demonstrated that those benefits of deferred taxation were of far less value than believed. What has been overlooked is that at the same time that the federal government implemented tax reform, the regulatory environment in which landlords operated drastically changed. Stringent rent regulations, including rent control, were introduced in the mid-1970s, permanently altering investors' view of multifamily rental housing business. In addition, the Strata Titles Act of 1966 and 1974 gave multifamily and residential developers a lucrative alternative, building condos. One program that everybody talks about as a panacea for the construction of new purpose-built rental housing is a well-known multiple unit residential building program, or MURB program. Well, our report dispels that myth. Research shows that the tax benefit of the MURB program were capitalized into land values, and as such, the returns on these investments were no different than non-MURB projects. As a result, when the tax benefits of the MURB program actually did, what the tax benefits of the MURB program actually did was bestow windfall gains to existing landowners rather than make purpose-built rental housing more attractive to build. Furthermore, and what is not widely known or appreciated, the success of the MURB program hinged critically upon the distinction that virtually all MURB projects were strata titled, and now not true purpose-built rental, providing investors with the significant risk mitigating option to sell the units of such projects into the ownership market to reap their returns. The BC rental industry was free from rent control and restrictive regulations before the 1970s, and I would remind everyone that this was a time when we had strong immigration, and not unlike today. But unlike today, we were actually building the necessary rental housing to provide homes for these new residents. Once rent controls and restrictive regulation were introduced into the rental market, investors viewed strata condo development as more attractive, as it was free of price controls. In fact, condo prices were supported by a federal capital gains taxes exemption on principal residences. As a result of these factors, purpose-built rental construction plummeted in comparison to condos. The introduction of rent control and restrictive regulations toward landlords changed the business environment for this investment dramatically. Once these changes were made, even though rent control was removed in the early 1980s during a period of recession, the mere anticipation of rent control is enough to have a chilling effect on such investment. And in fact, investors have been correct to be worried about further rent control and restrictive regulations, which were introduced in BC in the 1990s, again in 2004 with the revision of the Residential Tenancy Act, and then again in 2017 with the election of the NDP government, with most notably in September of 2018 when they changed the maximum annual allowable increase. All of these changes have reinforced the notion in investors' minds that the market for rental housing is fraught with political obstacles to achieving a reasonable return on investment. Investors are making a 60 to 100-year decision when deciding to construct new rental housing, and they need the assurance that the ability to recover profits won't be usurped by government. Multifamily developers have a unique alternative of building residential condominiums, which are free from price controls and subsidized by the federal government with a capital gains tax exemption on owner-occupied units. As a result, rational developers and investors will choose to build condominiums over market rental housing. To create more rental housing supply requires three major changes to the regulatory and business environment. One, the removal of restrictive regulation towards market rental buildings. Two, municipal zoning bylaw changes that remove biases against rental housing and can equate land values between rental housing development and condominium development. And three, eliminate federal GST on a self-supply of rental housing. Now, in our report, we actually made a few recommendations, which I'll run through very quickly. On the rental regulation side, we said, number one, immediately allow more liberal rent increases for existing units to better cover cost inflation and maintenance. Two, immediately implement a complete rent control exemption for new, constructed, secure, purpose-built rental units for a maximum of 25 years. And over time, consider the phasing out of rent controls entirely. In terms of municipal zoning bylaw changes for rental development, we said reduce or eliminate parking minimums, increase density allowable relative to condo developments, reduce minimum unit sizes, fast-track applications, eliminate CACs, and also take a really hard look at inclusionary zoning of below-market suites in purpose-built rental. And finally, on the federal taxation side, eliminate GST on the completion of new purpose-built rental. The GST was introduced in 1991. While it was not part of a report, the self-supply penalty on new purpose-built rental has to be eliminated. These changes would mitigate the challenging business environment in which rental housing providers must operate, and it would also equate land value between condos and private market rental. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much, David. Stimulating. I've got a couple of questions already, but we're going to transition to Tony before we get to that.
Well, I didn't even have all those risk factors on my list, but thanks, David. First, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out on such a wet, dark evening, and thank to David and Jesse for putting this together. I'm born in Vancouver and have been involved in real estate most of my life. We've owned from commercial to residential and built strata and different types of retail. We're relatively small compared to some of the developers in the city, but we've localized our projects primarily in the Vancouver area. We've done one in North Vancouver. We started talking about workforce housing and rental housing as a serious option for new development when we had some 100-year-old buildings and 60-year-old buildings, and we'd have 20, 25, 40 people show up to rent a one-bedroom suite, and 35 of them you would rent to. So if I had a 35-unit building, I would have filled it in one night. And these were young people, older people, good jobs, and not being able to find a decent place near their work. And then something happened called 9/11. And I remember most of the police officers and first responders in New York don't live in Manhattan. They live in New Jersey. And they couldn't get in for 3, 4, 5 days to refresh the troops. And I said, the workers, and I said, you know, what would happen if something like that happened in Vancouver, like an earthquake or something? And some of the deputy chiefs and stuff in Vancouver told me most of their constables lived in Surrey, as most of the fire department lived in Burnaby or Surrey or farther out. And we live in an earthquake zone, and everyone keeps saying we're going to have one in the next 20 years, and I've been hearing that for 40 years. So we're connected by bridges and all this stuff. So we started looking at these things and talking with people at the city of Vancouver about 20 years ago about workforce housing and rental incentives. And finally, a program came up called Rental 100, and some people don't like it and not. And then MERP came out about a year and a half ago, I think. And that targeted people making incomes between 30 and 80,000. So, the people we rely on every day for lots of things, from coffee to nurses to teachers. And I talk to people at the school board. They're having trouble getting new teachers to start on the west side or anywhere near downtown. Police constables choosing not to be a police officer in Vancouver because they can't live near their jobs. I walked around and talked to some businesses on 4th Avenue. We have a project we're doing in Khelsilem, and I had a chat for about half an hour with a young lady who is a bank manager at the TD Bank. And she travels an hour and a half each way from New Westminster to 4th and Cypress to work. 3 hours a day. And I said, something's wrong when people have to do this. So we were very enthusiastic about the MERP program. We have 2 projects going in them. And, there's opposition to projects. I mean, we get that in every project. I don't think the public always understands it's the city's policy that we're trying to follow. It's not something we make up in a back room and then try and ram it through. We're just following the steps. So the politicians and staff make those decisions, not us. We bear the brunt of the criticism a lot, but all we're trying to do is build different types of housing for people. Some are luxury condos, and those are good, but when I grew up in Vancouver, my dad was a cook, immigrant family. We had a bartender across the street, an orthodontist next door, an accountant, a couple judges, a mayor, and all the kids played together. That was a great neighborhood because we were all different. And you just don't see that as much anymore, the street parties and hockey games and things like that. I just think the city is a better city, a healthier city, a better place to live when we have diverse people living together in the same neighborhoods throughout the city, not just certain areas. So as you can tell, I'm pro-rental, I'm pro-condo, I'm pro-anything, but I need diversity. I don't just want one type of housing for one type of the market, and that's either end of the market. I think mix is good, but we're going to have trouble going forward if the workers can't live near work. I drive 25, 30 minutes sometimes, and I need to take a nap. I can imagine someone an hour and a half trying to get to work each direction, 3 hours a day. I mean, think about what you could do with that time. I just think it's just a waste of resources, human resources that we have. So I think it's going to be a big problem coming up. So I think we need to build more rental housing. So that's it for me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Up next, we've got Khelsilem. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Khelsilem, and I just really want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here and to be on this panel. Unfortunately, I get to, if anybody takes a photo of me and uploads this panel to the all-male panel, I will have my first photo ever taken on Tumblr, if anybody's seen that. Yeah. So I apologize for that. But unfortunately, Anne couldn't make it, so otherwise it would have been different.
Well, should have had more than one.
Yeah.
Mea culpa.
But I do want to acknowledge that. So my interest in this subject is both, I would say, a professional interest in terms of my role as a council member with the Squamish Nation, and also a personal interest. I am a renter. I live in the city of Vancouver, and I've lived here for almost 5 or 6 years and lived on the North Shore for a few years. So once I became an adult, I basically became a renter. And I became a renter because there was no housing options for me in my community on any of our reserves. Because for the last number of decades, we've only built single detached houses for the most part. A few townhouse projects here and there, but largely single detached. And that's for a whole list of reasons in terms of the limits to be able to build housing types on First Nations reserve lands. More housing options off reserve, so I became a renter. As a renter, I would say that my experience is, anecdotal in the sense that this is my limited experience and other people have had other experiences. I had the fortunate of having some educational background and progressing a certain level in my career that I have more options because of my income level relative to what the market is out there for renters. But for, I think, a lot of people in the city over the number of decades, especially Indigenous people, when we look at things like homelessness or low-income stats, we can say that the housing crisis, as we've described it over the last number of years, is felt differently by different groups of people over a different time period. And so for my people, we've been in a housing crisis much longer than most people have, both in terms of, and so then that's kind of my personal interest, is that as a renter and as somebody who experiences life as a renter, I have an interest in seeing policy changes and advancement in favor of rental for the reasons that I think rental provide that kind of security and opportunity for renters that either condo is not available, or condo in terms of renting from a condo owner or a single detached house owner and things like that doesn't provide the security that I think purpose-built rental can provide. But on the long term, I also think that part of the solution to our housing crisis is going to be by building more rental to be able to address not necessarily the affordability crisis in our city, but definitely the vacancy crisis, and the way that the vacancy crisis has been a problem for a lot of people when you're below 1% or around 1%. So those are kind of my more personal interests in this, and as a person who's involved in policy, both within my nation and also at a regional level, I come at it also from another perspective. As was mentioned, the Squamish Nation is in a unique position after many years of struggle to have our rights recognized and our jurisdiction respected as a layer of government within our territory, going back to Confederation all the way through the constitutional talks to successive Supreme Court victories, and also changes in policy from a very patriarchal, paternalistic policy towards First Nations governance to a change that we're seeing through the lens of reconciliation at all levels of government. And where I find, what excites me about that work and that aspect is being able to state publicly that the largest property owner in the city of Vancouver is the 3 local First Nations. There is no developer that owns more land than Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh combined. And that was through the use of our rights as enshrined in Section 35 of the Constitution to be able to negotiate with the federal and provincial governments for lands to be repatriated back to our nations. And of course, this is the MST lands, Jericho, Heather Street, Fairmont, and a few others. And those projects are ongoing. What the nations decided to do was, in the interest of good governance, set up a arm's length development corporation to manage the development of those lands and to work with other developers to partner on the development of those lands, as well as to work with the city through the city's policies, policy statements and rezonings and things like that to advance those things. But we're in a unique position where the development of those lands are used to directly support the advancement of social programs for our community. So when we're talking about all the social issues that we're dealing with as a First Nation, whether it be things like affordable housing or healthcare or culture or education, that the development of these lands is directly going to be used to fund those types of social programs. It's basically all the windfall is coming back to our community. And those are projects that we are working on and have acquired lands as fee simple lands with the intention to hold as leasehold for a long period of time, and mixed development of rental, affordable housing, and possibly some strata. And we're working through that process with the neighborhoods in the city in terms of developing those policy statements, especially through a lens of reconciliation. What does it mean for a community that has, and I can't remember the exact number, but let's use Jericho, for example, where it's a very tiny FSR on a very large piece of land, and say the FSR was to be expanded. What does it mean to actually increase the type of housing that's offered in that area, but do it through a lens of reconciliation where we're talking about including Indigenous culture, heritage, and people within the developments that we're doing? And I think that's a different lens. You know, if we were to take a very kind of stereotypical kind of, just to use the phrase, NIMBY attitude around it, well, backyard has a different meaning for my community, I think. But then we also, as mentioned, we have our Sanok project, or what we call Sanok, which is often known as the Khelsilem Reserve, near the Kits Point area. And that one is uniquely different. It is on reserve lands, unlike the other parcels of land. It was land that we had to fight through the court system to have returned to us after an illegal sale by the federal government back in the 1930s and prior. And so when we're looking at that development and the ability to create economic development for our community, we are looking at residential purpose-built rental. And we are making the choice as a nation, when we've looked at the opportunities around rental to condo, especially on a parcel of land like that, there is a challenge in terms of the amount of money we theoretically could make if we were to choose condo compared to rental, and how much we would theoretically be leaving on the table if we were to do condo. And we also have the benefit of acquiring that cash up front so we can make those investments into our community now. But as a First Nation that's looking at long-term economic wealth generation, to be able to fund a lot of work within our community over the next number of decades and generations, rental provides a different type of revenue stream for us and a different type of opportunity. But then what I've learned through this process is that you start getting into things like minimum mandatory parking, and you start thinking about density and the ability to how rental actually in itself allows for a larger scale type of density as opposed to condo because of the way the market reacts to, say, no parking on site or very minimal parking on site, things like that. And so I think that for us, the opportunity is through economic development of real estate and largely through rental, because we're interested in that kind of long-term revenue stream for our nation. But I think we're also honestly very excited about the ability to entertain the development of rental within the city because we see it as an opportunity to provide that back to the city as well. And that the windfall gains that we're going to make are not going to us as a private developer, we're going to us as a community. And those are going to be reinvested back into our community. And I think that that's an interesting proposition as the nations theoretically acquire more land or conduct more development over the years. And that the conversation for us is that this is the opportunity that we have because most of our lands have been devastated, unlike other First Nations around the country or the province where they might be looking at royalty revenues from natural resource extraction. Real estate is the opportunity for us, and that's the play that we're going to make. But it's, I think, a different flavor for us, and I think it's an exciting opportunity for us to engage in this conversation around rental and around housing in a way that could provide honestly, a significant amount of meaningful action for Indigenous communities to be able to accomplish a lot of our goals that we have for our community. And so I think in closing, I'd just say that this conversation is one that we're engaging in. It's one that we're still participating in. It's one that we still want to, in good faith, in genuine good faith, work with the city, work with the neighbors, and work with the community on. And so there's things like the Hutniak project, which there's been some details released out to the public. There'll be more coming soon. We'll be going to a referendum with our membership in December to seek their approval on moving forward on the leasing of those lands in the business partnership terms that we've negotiated with the potential partner. And we'll be seeking our membership's approval, and then a lot of the details around the project are going to become public in the next little while because of that. So it's a conversation that's ongoing, but I think for us, honestly, on our side, we're interested in a good faith conversation around it. So.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And now for something completely different, Josh Gordon, SFU. There's a slide advancer there.
So, since I'm a prof, of course I have to have slides. Okay, so as Tom said at the start, I'm going to say some points to raise potentially some skepticism around this topic, some of which will annoy people in here, and I'm determined to enjoy this regardless. All right, so why build purpose-built rental? There's two main justifications that I can tell. The first is, as has been mentioned, security of tenure, right? So in a rental building, you have less likelihood of being evicted from the owner who might move back in or move a family member in or something like that, or rent evict you or something along those lines. So there's a security of tenure. The second claim that's often made about purpose-built rental is, well, we have a rental crisis, so we've got to build rental, and that's going to give renters a stronger position in the market, improve the vacancy rate, lower rents, etc. Does the second claim hold water? I'm going to argue no, it doesn't, in all likelihood. And so that leaves the first rationale, which is security of tenure. And then, to me, the question is, that's an important goal, but is purpose-built rental the only way of achieving security of tenure? And then, how much is it worth to a municipal government or the provincial government to achieve that security of tenure? And who gets that security of tenure? Is it people of moderate incomes, low incomes, high incomes, right? So those are the important questions I think we should have a discussion about, and that I think are the crux of kind of a lot of these policy debates. So, some claims. So here's kind of claims. These are all over the place if you look them up. This is City of Vancouver staff report. For several decades, there was very little purpose-built rental supply. Purpose-built rental housing built in Vancouver, creating a shortage in supply. High demand and a lack of new supply has put pressure on existing rental housing, leading to low vacancy rates, right? So there's a kind of a causal claim being made here. Adrian Crook, BC Rental Project. The more new rental homes we build, the more competition landlords have, the less they can increase rent. Every rental home we delay just raises our rents today, extra questionable, and denies us affordable rentals tomorrow. Okay, so that's the claim. So, this is the typical pattern that they point to. Well, we built a bunch in the 60s and 70s, and then in the 1980s and onwards, we didn't build very much. We've started to build a little bit more, but this is a long-term crisis. It's been a long time building, et cetera, et cetera. So this is kind of the story. But again, is there good evidence for this? So this is the apartment vacancy rate. So the appeals are always done to the apartment vacancy rate. We have a 1% vacancy rate. That means that we haven't been building enough. Well, hold on a sec. First of all, a 1% vacancy rate or a sub 1% vacancy rate has been experienced a number of times in Vancouver, even during the 1970s when we were building a lot of purpose-built rental. The second thing to note about this is that Vancouver and Victoria fluctuate almost identically in large measure over this period. There is a little bit of divergence in the late 1990s, but by and large they go together. The vacancy rate goes together. The same thing if I had included Kelowna, it just got messy, so I didn't do that, but the same thing would apply. So is the vacancy rate about how much is being built or how much rental construction is being built, or is it a product of business cycle dynamics? Essentially, when you have a strong economy, the rental vacancy rate goes way down. And then the third point I'd want to make about this chart is, what does this suggest in terms of what municipal policy can accomplish, right? So this is for the metro region. What can one municipality do by virtue of small policy levers to actually change this in a substantial way, right? And so my claim is that it almost certainly can't do very much. Here is Calgary and Edmonton. This is just to reinforce the point that essentially vacancy rates are business cycle type dynamics, and they vary across time in that way. And even in Calgary and Edmonton, apparently, places where it's easy to build and all the rest, you still have sub 1% vacancy rates at many occasions when they have a very hot economy. So essentially, the low vacancy rate is the product of a hot economy, nothing more, nothing less. So here's some peer-reviewed literature on the connection between vacancy rates, rents, and purpose-built rental construction in Canada. You think I'm going to add bullet points to this? I'm not going to add bullet points to this. There is no paper or papers of any sort that establish this connection. What about the rate of housing construction? Again, nothing. No peer-reviewed research that shows this. Yet we're making policy on the basis of these claims that are made and repeated time after time. I threw this in just because I wanted to. This is not really related. But supply constraints, are those really the cause of Vancouver's high housing prices? Do we have any peer-reviewed research on that? No, we do not. Okay, so a couple of final points. First, the context, which is in Metro Vancouver currently, we are building more than we have ever built before. We have 45,000 units under construction. So what is the strong motivation to push hard on rental when we are already building a ton, and when we're not even sure that building rental is actually going to improve the vacancy rate, right? So we're already building a ton. What is the motivation? What are we willing to give up? Are we willing to give up DCL waivers, pass up CACs, right, to get a lot of density bonuses, and so on and so forth? What are we willing to do in order to do something which is already, supply is already on the way? It's already being delivered. And then the second point I would make is there are a range of alternative policy options that could provide immediate relief to people in the rental market. Cracking down on Airbnb, this is something, in my view, that should definitely be done. Vacancy tax enforcement, we have that. How well it's being enforced, that's an open question. Better compensation for rent eviction and dem-eviction, clearly there's a need here. In my view, the compensation that exists at the moment is not nearly sufficient. People who are kicked out for those reasons, they have kind of modest compensation for a short period of time, but largely they're going to be kicked out of their cities once they do that. Can we provide targeted income support for low-income renters? Can we essentially bypass the supply channel and directly provide assistance? Probably that's a good course of action. And then the final thing, the scary boogeyman that I'm going to leave you with, what about rental-only zoning? If the big issue is the competition between strata and rental, why don't we look at that? I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Well, a lot of provocative questions. So let me do both on just the business end, and probably Tony would be the best to answer this, but generally on the policy side, all of you can chime in. Rental versus condo. So I guess, one question is, a lot of condo is rental, so what do we need purpose-built rental for? What are the pros and cons? Josh does bring up, until recently, condos seem to be outbidding purpose-built rental, but about a half of them were rental, and some of them are certainly owner-occupied that aren't rental. So, is it worth cities giving up money to the extent they have to? But then B, do they have to give up money because is it now the case that condo is getting outbid by rental? That's one. The other question that comes up from David's talk is, if I heard correctly, in came the NDP, and smack, maybe rental only. So there goes your strata, rent control, no fixed term leases. So
You didn't hear it entirely correctly, but anyway.
I didn't. But you'd think, with certainly with the rent control, 2% a year, which is that's a big hit. You'd think the time series you'd see more demand for owner housing supply and less demand for rental supply ex post. But I think arguably you've seen the opposite. Since rent control came in at an extra 2% per year, just to play devil's advocate here, it seems like that's when rental supply has really taken off. So if anybody wants to chime in on any of these, can condo continue to compete with rental? Why? Why could that be true given the policy options? And any thoughts on thumb on the scale in favor of rental?
I'll go first. First of all, the system, anybody in the room who's involved in the building, is set up to build condo. There's no question. It's easier to get a condo approved through the city, any of the cities in the metro. The planners, everybody is used to condo, and then they try to have you build the rental to look like condo, which makes it unaffordable as rental to build. So we're going to be seeing buildings with less glass, no air conditioning, not as high ceilings, more brick probably, and all these things are to keep the operating cost of the building lower, vis-a-vis the rents lower and the tenants paying less. You're not going to have the big fancy gym and the swimming pool in a rental building because rentals don't pay strata fees to pay for those things. So putting that aside, the one interesting thing I think Josh left out, 4 points I wrote down, was the quality and the age of the existing rental stock. Some of them are in terrible shape. They have things like asbestos in them, mold, inadequate mechanical systems. They're very environmentally deficient. They waste a lot of energy, whether it's electricity or gas or whatever. Some of them are very, very unsafe buildings to live in. I wouldn't want to own one as an owner and manager. They don't have life safety features. They don't have accessibility. Some don't have elevators for an aging population. And some of them, quite frankly, are nearing the end of their economic life. They're just old and have not been looked after. Old buildings are great if they're looked after. You have to update things and improve them. So unfortunately, we have a huge percentage of our existing rental stock that is not functional for today's society from a lot of issues. My primary one would be environmental, like the asbestos and mold, the wasting of energy, and accessibility issues. I think these are huge things. We have an aging population. People with wheelchairs, walkers just can't be very mobile in these buildings. So I don't know, I think that answered part of the question, but I'll let David.
I guess on the business side, there's just generally, it's easier to do condo.
I think the world is set up in the development industry is to design, build, and deliver condo, from window wall systems and stuff, which to me are not very environmentally friendly. You need to heat them up in the winter, and you need to cool them down in the summer constantly. I'm a big proponent of passive environmental features like shading windows, orientating the buildings to not be in the sun all day. We all experience coming home to a very hot house. It's not a comfortable thing, or a very cold house. So the one thing about old buildings that's really good is they leak and they breathe and air is moving around, and we have to do that mechanically today, so or passively. So I just think, you know, if we're trying to live in a better way, you need to live close to where you work, and there has to be alternate ways of getting around. And if it takes you an hour, 35, 40 minutes to move around just to get something, it's hard. Or, you know, there's some parts of the city where you got to drive 25 minutes to get a quart of milk. To me, that's hard. That's a hard thing to do. So I think we need more new buildings, and unfortunately we have to replace some of the old buildings. And the displacement is what we should be talking about, and how we move those people around, either temporarily and then back into the new housing. I wish we had like a 500-unit building somewhere where we could put people temporarily while the new housing was built and bring them back. I'll let David go from
Please.
there.
Yeah, I mean, the tenant displacement, there's solutions around that. It's just, so far, you know, I think all stakeholders haven't really worked together to find progressive solutions. I mean, Josh's point is well taken. You know, I think that's the issue of our time here right now. If we need to build more new rental or redevelop the existing one, whatever the case, certainly existing renters getting displaced is not a desirable outcome. And so that, I think major strides have been taken on that front by a number of municipalities, City of Vancouver, et cetera, and there's more that can be done, but it has to be done in the context of, you know, what's the capacity to, you know, where's the balance there in terms of all these innumerable cost drivers and being able to actually, you know, deliver new rental housing. I will take exception to my friend Josh's comment there on the supply thing. I mean, Josh, I didn't know you were a supply denier, and I'm really disappointed. But we're still friends. Nevertheless, sure, you know, there's no peer-reviewed studies. I guess that's correct. The fact of the matter is, you know, we have had persistently low vacancy rates. We have, 35, 40,000 people, whatever the number is, moving into Metro every year. We have so many opportunities here for growth and success. 76% of all new residents that move into Vancouver are renters. The reality is that security of tenure is critically important. Josh is obviously not a renter, or are you, my friend?
I am.
You are. And what do you rent? A purpose-built rental? Do you rent a purpose-built rental?
not.
You're in a condo?
Yeah.
Okay, so you realize it's probably some family-owned thing or something, right?
It is.
So he doesn't have to worry about having the units sold out under him, and anybody else who rents here who isn't in purpose-built rental knows exactly what I'm talking about. So the reality is we do have a supply issue. We need to, our economy continues to grow. We have great prospects here for continued growth, and until we address the vacancy rate, it frustrates me to no end when we talk about number of units. We just approved X hundred units or 1,000 units. The number that I care about is getting to 3, 4, 5% vacancy rate, and then you can come and talk to me about success.
Let me ask a question, because it came up about rent eviction, what have you, the displaced tenants on new construction. Is Burnaby getting it about right, or are they putting too much weight on compensation for tenants? Or is it going to be doable to get building done there under the new rules?
Well, anybody here from Burnaby? That's a tough one to call. Tenant dislocation is a huge issue, and I'll be honest with you, personally, I've always struggled with the tenant relocation policies, and I guess, they have become more generous, and I think that's really necessary. But what I've seen really work successfully is where progressive, responsible rental developers have, they've worked with each individual tenant in a really thoughtful, respectful, sensitive fashion to look at where they are in their life cycle, what their needs are, and it's a hand-holding exercise to help these people find new housing, and that's supplemented by the tenant relocation policies, and I think when that's done in that really thoughtful, respectful manner, those transitions can work, and I think that's an opportunity right there. I also think that we should be looking at transitional rent supports through what I call portable housing benefits. So the lump sum for moving, what have you, I think that money can evaporate quickly, and I think the other way to look at this is maybe less of this front-end loading and having some rent supplements for some period of time to fill in some of the gap that invariably does appear for these folks when they move into their new housing. It's more than likely going to be more expensive. So, like I said, there are creative solutions. I think it's a question of getting all the stakeholders involved, but again, I want to go back to, we have a supply crunch, a supply crisis. We need to build more secure, purpose-built rental housing. That's the only way I see it.
You have a lot of, I'll go again. You have a lot of condo landlords, I imagine, in Landlord BC, or are you, I guess the question is, how did condo ever work? I mean, what fraction of, if you've done them, what fraction of the buyers are landlords in a pre-sale?
I have no idea. All I do know is that in terms of the rental universe, roughly 2/3 of landlords in British Columbia are in the secondary market. And the reason that secondary market is so significant, and thank God we have it, I guess, is the fact that we weren't building secure purpose-built rental for 40 years. So if you don't build that housing typology, and as I said in my comments, when we had tax policy encouraging the building of strata condo units, once the floodgates open there, that basically killed the opportunity, the advantage to build purpose-built rental.
I guess the issue, and I'd welcome any other thoughts, is there seems like there'd be an economy of scale issue. If all these condos were being bought by end users who are going to be owner-occupiers, the tax argument, the rent control argument makes a ton of sense. That you put your thumb on the scale towards home ownership, and lo and behold, you got a lot of home ownership. The issue, though, is to the extent half of the building is bought by one-off landlords, then you get into it. Isn't there an economy of scale to owning a building? Maybe Tony, you can answer that question. Does it actually save you anything to own the whole building as opposed to owning a condo or two and renting them out?
Well, from a landlord's point of view, you have more control. Typically, stratas aren't professional building managers that run them, and some of them do a really good job, and some of them don't do a very good job. I just think it's just more achievable for someone to have a one-bedroom condo that they rent out rather than paying $3 or $4 or $5 million for a 10-suite apartment building and use that as a rental building. But back to your demo eviction thing, a word I really don't like because it's not always for the reason why people say. I mean, we have 2 MERP projects going through the city of Vancouver that displace 0 people.
Yeah.
And people have still found reasons to oppose them. So I think, people are resistive to change. And this city is going to change a lot if the amount of people they say, I guess they haven't done a proper study yet, but the amount of people they say are coming here or are going to be coming here, or the companies leasing office space downtown in the hundreds of thousands of square feet, if we don't have places for those workers to live close to their work, those companies will go somewhere else. And maybe some people are happy with that. Other people may not be happy with that. But to me, our governments work on tax revenue, and they collect taxes from people, and that's what paves our roads and keeps teachers in our schools and hospitals running. And if there's fewer people coming here, then the ones that are here are going to pay more. And I think we pay a lot to live in this great city, and I think we're happy not increasing our tax load. So we need to get more options for those workers to live here. I was reading Monocle magazine, a magazine I get, and it had a little section on British Columbia. It goes around the world, and it said British Columbia in the October issue, rising rents and a lack of affordable housing have forced many out of the market in the metro. Vancouver area younger voters want a commitment to building rental housing and a clear path to home ownership. This is like an international magazine that's saying what they think of BC. So, if that's the city we want, great. I don't agree with that. I don't think we should be limiting people. If you want to live in Zurich, maybe go to Zurich. But I don't think that's the great thing that's made Vancouver a great city. I think we need diversity, different types of economic people living in all places. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to turn over to Khelsilem, who faces a choice in some sense with the option of condo, take a lot of cash. Maybe some people struggling with affordability in the Squamish Nation take the cash and move far away or distant, or you build rental and provide some on-site. So that's been a choice you've had to make, and so your thoughts on that I think would be interesting in contrast.
Yeah, and I think the quick point around the strata in terms of why not just have strata be all of the rental that we supply into the market. And I mean, there's also limits on that, right? That was one of the recommendations that went from the task force to the province, was actually to lift the ban on, strata councils can actually put a ban on rental within their strata. And so there was a recommendation to actually change that. The province chose not to, perhaps for some successful lobbying efforts from some people. But on the question about the condo versus rental thing, I'll give you an example, and I don't know how many people are aware of this in the room or not. But so let's say we're looking at 1 million square feet of buildable space, theoretically. When we were looking at that type of comparison, because we did an RFP for our development on Hutniak. We went to market, we put it out to all the developers to partner with us. And we said, we want a partnership. Here's some gateway issues that we want included in any proposal, but we want the consideration on the different types of projects that we would entertain, whether that be, say, 100% condo to 100% rental and everything in between. And when we actually ran the numbers and compared it, if you're doing an analysis and you have to make a couple of assumptions. So one of them is, let's do 1 million square feet of condo. We get all that cash up front, assuming the market can provide that there's enough, enough demand there to be able to actually sell 1 million square feet of condo. That once we got that cash and compared that with, say, investing it back into the market through some sort of return on, say, 5%, versus doing 1 million square feet of rental over 99 years and try and compare the two, we're leaving $1 billion on the table over 99 years. And that was a straight comparison of rental to condo. So why would we do rental if we're going to leave $1 billion on the table? Same amount of square feet, but over a 99-year period. Now that makes a couple of assumptions that we're going to get a consistent 5% over 99 years, and we might do better and might do that worse.
So you were taking a 5% cost to your capital per year?
I mean, I guess the thing is, what this comes down to, though, in terms of the different levers and the different tools that are being played here, is that whether there are certain levers being pushed to move the market towards building condo because it's just a better investment on that. Or there's other things too, which is, I think, the density question, where you start to change things like interest rates or density level. That if I can now do 1.5 million or 2 million or 3 million square feet, now it's actually equal to what I would have been doing if it was 1 million square feet of condo. So now the city and other governments, and in our case, the Squamish Nation is the government, as well as the developer. So that change in FSR is on both sides, or on our own side. But there's other things. Let's look at CMHC and the rental incentives that they're using, the federal government, in a way that are putting money into the rental market to be able to tip the scales in support of rental. And when you run the math on looking at some of the CMHC-backed financing, when they're pushing for rental with some affordability requirements in there, it starts to make rental much more enticing compared to condo. And so the government is using all of these levers to try and make rental more attractive, and it's starting to work. I mean, we're seeing it in Vancouver, we're seeing it across the region. We're obviously interested in it for those reasons. But it does go back to that central question of why rental or why not condo, or why neither, if that's also the question being posed. But I think for us, when we start layering in either density or interest rates on the mortgages that we're going to take out, the financing, the rental, this offers those types of benefits. But then there's other types of benefits too, in terms of, I think, the points around what type of communities we're building, the connected communities that we're building, complete communities, in terms of, for us, we're looking at really strong greenhouse gas emission efficiencies on our developments, because as a nation, we really care a lot about the climate crisis and the climate emergency. And so we started thinking about complete communities and the need to actually reduce urban sprawl and actually build denser communities to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the region. Things like that. They're also, I think, important values for us, and I think they're important values for a lot of people in the region. Yeah.
If I can just ask, you mentioned $1 billion on the table. Interest rates are extremely low in the economy, and rents have been growing. Obviously the province felt the need to step in. If your 4% was binding, and now you're down to 2%, but you mark it up on the renewals. What does the Squamish Nation think its cost of its own capital is? So what's the alternative rate of return? Is that the 5% you were talking about? Is it lower?
I mean, it depends on a lot of things. Those were just kind of a way for us to be able to compare apples to apples between each of the types of options we were considering. I mean, from 100% condo, 100% rental, 80% to 20% or inverse, or 50% to 50%, things like that. I mean, there's other reasons why we might include some condo to be able to create enough capital to be able to do some of the rental, which I think happens a lot as well. But it was just an apples to apples comparison to see whether we wanted to one way or the other. And there's different reasons why we might choose it on different sites too. The location relative to transit, or location relative to the downtown area, things like that.
I want to ask one more question of Josh, but I know that some of you have written down questions, so if we can, if anybody has any questions to sort of hand in, maybe they can raise a hand, and we can have a volunteer pick up some cards here and there. Would be great, because I think there's some good audience questions. But Josh, you wanted to chime in here.
Sure. So just one question. So we were talking before about the project on Denny's, right? The Broadway project, Tony. And so, as I understand it, the initial proposal was something like 16 floors, correct?
Perfect.
No, 17 is
Right. And then, but then there was a push to increase it to 28, is that correct?
a new policy came out, moderate income rental, wanted to inject affordability into it. But I don't want to really talk about specific projects. I want to talk about, especially when they're not approved.
Yeah.
But thanks for bringing it up.
Okay. Well,
But again, we're going to put a $6 billion subway line there.
right.
And you want to keep the density where it is, or you want to actually pay for, or contribute more to the subway line? That's the real question. I don't think it's, 28, 17, 5, 6. The biggest thing that's going to, with all due respect, Tom, it's not the interest rate, it's the construction cost and getting these things built in time. Without certainty, time, the cost is going to go through the roof. When that subway line starts construction, you're going to be hard-pressed to get anybody to build anything somewhere else. It's going to be another Olympics again. There's going to be a huge ramp-up in construction costs. And every developer in this room is more worried about construction costs and getting the building finished on time and approved on time than they are about the interest rate on the loan.
Well, I was in cost of capital, but here's a great question from the audience. Sorry, go ahead, please.
I didn't get a chance
Sorry,
to
please.
make my point. The point is this, is when we're comparing condo and purpose-built rental, how much is the city giving up in potential foregone revenue when it gives the rental zoning, right? So you have the DCL waiver, and then you have the density bonus, and sometimes those can be quite significant. And so you have both the passed up DCL, which I was reading a staff report, it's about $10,000 a unit, and then the CAC, which could be some quite substantial number. And I was curious if anybody in the crowd knows kind of what that all works out to per unit. So like in the sense of, if the benefit of purpose-built rental is largely about the security of tenure, how much are we paying as a city in order to get that? Well, and then let me make a further point. And then who is getting that? And do they need security of tenure? Because if you are building purpose-built rental and it's going to people who are making $80,000 to $150,000 in large part, those people have security of tenure. It's called cash. So you ask, I was asked about my rental situation. If the landlord sent somebody in, kicked me out, that would suck because I like the unit I'm in currently. But I'd land on my feet. I'd be okay. It's the people who don't have a lot of income, those are the people who really need the security of tenure. And if you're building purpose-built rental that's not housing those people, and that's the record, unfortunately, is lately the purpose-built rental that's being built is not being built for those people, then what are you giving it up for? So, we have a principle which is you try to pay for growth, you try to pay for development, and this argument around security of tenure is being used to bypass a lot of that. And I think that there's some healthy skepticism that is merited.
Well, when you build a condo, there is no security of tenure. When you build purpose-built rental in the city of Vancouver, it's the only thing I can really talk about, and city of North Vancouver, those are rental buildings for the life of the project, forever. You can never stratify them, you can't sell them off individually. And one more further level is the MERP program, which the rents are set by the city, the increase is set by the RTB, and they're about half of market right now, and they're geared towards $30,000 to $80,000 a year, and the people income qualify for those units. That person doesn't leave, and the landlord doubles the rent or anything like that. So the problem is you have to think of rental housing as a community benefit or amenity. It is. You're providing housing for people who couldn't live in that area. Whether they make $150,000 or $30,000, they could not buy a house there. I would struggle to purchase my house today, given the value of it is today. I purchased something 32 years ago and was mortgage heavy all the last 32 years. And because of inflation, you look like a real estate genius, the Warren Buffett of real estate. But it wasn't because I did anything to that house. It didn't change. It just went up. And that's the problem we have here is if you want to go buy a $2.5 million house and you walk into your local bank, they're going to tell you to put $1.5 million down as a down payment. And I don't know about you guys, I don't have $1.5 million sitting in my back pocket to put down on a house. So that's the problem today in Vancouver. It's not the income level necessarily, but we're not even providing housing for someone who can pay a market rent in that area to live. They need to go farther out. So you're sort of mixing apples and pears here, but that's, I guess, what we're supposed to do. So
One more thought, and then I've got some others.
But, okay, just quickly, the apples and pears is the comparison between rental and ownership. And of course, for ownership, there's many people that can't afford to own in certain areas. The ability to rent in a whole range of areas is feasible. And so that's a separate question. And again, for a long time, purpose-built rental was not built, but nevertheless, you have people who live in secondary suites, in older strata buildings, and so on and so forth, that are paying relatively modest rents. So it's not as if modest rents don't exist in a world without purpose-built rental.
So you think it's okay to live in a basement suite for the next 30 years? I just don't.
That's a total caricature, and that's a nice talking point, but that's not what is the reality.
I'm not trying to be a comedian. I'm actually. No. We need new rental housing. You seem to think what we have, stuff filled with asbestos and mold and no sprinklers and not safe, and people trying to, walk their walker down the thing. You think that's adequate housing. You're entitled to your opinion. But I think we need new housing built for people with moderate incomes. And, the city of Vancouver states $950 for a studio apartment. That studio apartment would rent anywhere between $1,750 and $2,000. Half the rent in order for a guy or a person to make between 30 and 80 grand to live there. I think that's a good trade-off for giving some extra density and securing that for the life of the building. I just think these are good trade-offs to bring people who wouldn't otherwise be able to live in that area, given the real estate prices, to live there. So I think that makes a better city. And you're entitled to not agree with that, but that's okay. But, when 30 and 40 people show up to rent an apartment, something's wrong. And it ain't the market building more or enough housing. So, we have some projects in the pipeline for 4 or 5, 6 years, and we're still talking about this. And some people want to push pause and wait to see what happens and to study it better and stuff. It's getting to get worse. And it's hard for people to live in the city now. So I think we need more housing. So
yeah. So this disagreement, particularly on whether you need condo or single family, is exactly the argument I wanted to see play out. So I thank you both for having me.
You're welcome, Tom.
So thank you very much. We have about, probably 10 more minutes we can chit chat. I could sit here all night and listen to you guys go back and forth, but we should get back to schmoozing and our families. So I do have one very interesting question for Khelsilem. Should the city of Vancouver remove itself as an approval authority over the MST lands? Would that not be best for reconciliation?
Provocative question. That's an interesting question. I would say that there is an interest by the nations to both do things in good faith, but also to be able to go further than I think a lot of other developers might, partly because our objectives within the process are slightly different. You know, if we're talking about affordability, I think like on the policy statement for the Heather Street lands, we got it to 40%. City required 20, right? We chose to go further because for us, there was actually other benefits than highest and best use. I think that there are legal structures that exist in Canada for why choosing to hold on to our MST lands as fee simple lands is better. From a financing standpoint, from a land value standpoint, things like that. And so yes, if we could rewrite everything in terms of the structure of Canada and the way that Canada has built its property system and the reserve system and the structure of ownership within the country and all that kind of stuff, we might choose to rewrite the rules a little bit differently. Given where we're at and given where the context, we look at it from a strategic objectives and say there's actually some strategic value in keeping it as fee simple land. There's lots of reasons why we would do that and go through the city's process to do that. What's different, obviously, I think for Squamish, and probably our neighbors as well, but Squamish specifically, because we have the Khelsilem development, is that was returned to us as reserve lands. It was originally reserve lands. It was expropriated by the government. It's now returned to us. And I think that there is an interest by our community, our members specifically, to say, you know, I think the context is the rest of the city has been built all this density around us. Yeah. All of the, I mean, this whole conversation, which we haven't really got into, but the whole conversation around speculation and the amount of windfall gains that have been made privately within the city over the last number of years is always a little bit ironic for me because, you know, the conversation around, you know, a bunch of foreigners making money in our real estate market is a little bit different for us. In context. And so when I think about windfall gains, I think there's a reasonable expectation from my community that maybe finally we'll be able to see the benefits of everything that's happened on our territory on the tiny piece of land that we have left, right? So I think that there's strategic reasons for doing both. We've made the choice to do both, and there's legal reasons why we have to do both. That's just the context of Canada. If we could rewrite it, yeah, of course we would, without a doubt. And I think there's lots of things that we would rewrite around this whole conversation, right? So.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, quick fact question. Somebody in our audience asked, Calgary we saw. Calgary's a problem for everybody on this panel, for at least for Josh and David. So, number one, it looked like the vacancy rate was also cyclical but consistently higher than Vancouver. So doesn't that say, you know, the easy supply makes for higher vacancy rates? But then on the other hand, for David, the occasional antagonist with Josh, Calgary does not have rent control, and yet apparently they build very, very little purpose-built rental. So is purpose-built rental, yeah, apparently no rent control.
That's not true. Well, they don't have any rent control, but they build purpose-built rental. There's a large purpose-built rental universe there in Calgary, Edmonton. There's many rental developers and owners, maybe in this room, certainly from Vancouver, who own purpose-built rental buildings in both Edmonton and Calgary. And it's a market they continue to look at, despite the downturn in the economy. There's still, I know of four rental owners and developers who are building and or acquiring properties in Edmonton and Calgary right now. So,
so not only deny the alligator, but also the allegation, just not true. Okay, great. That's an important fact clarification.
On the basis of what
I hear about REITs active there. So
REITs are really active there.
How come there's no REIT in Vancouver? Why is there no Vancouver REIT action?
That's a great question. They're all in Toronto. Yeah.
Returns are too low.
Well, he meant headquarters.
Well, but then you have all these condo guys. So, okay. So let's see. What should the feds be doing? We have a federal election going on. Any favorites, least favorites,
Remove
or missing?
GST from rental.
There we go.
I think the NDP is going there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's very disappointing it didn't happen. It was promised by
last time
by Justin Trudeau, and you know, I'm not even sure. We've had a couple of conversations with political parties that are sort of the larger political parties, I guess. No one seems to understand this issue, and so I guess we'll have to see who gets elected and go hammer away them again. So it's like a no-brainer. It needs to be fixed.
I think for ourselves, a lot of the work that's been done in terms of the federal government investing in CMHC to be able to provide the interest rate backed loans has been really important. I think is a huge shift to be able for developers and nonprofit housing developers as well as for profit developers to actually be able to go towards rental because of it. And so I think continuing to inject and support resources into that is actually a huge benefit for rental construction within the country.
Totally agree with that. That financing needs to continue. I know there are some rental developers very nervous right now that it could be pulled, and those projects will fall off the table.
Yeah.
What's the rate on that?
I don't know.
But 2.5.
Okay, so the government's getting a spread, right? So the government's getting a percent, not
But
bad.
you go with a certificate to any lender.
But, you know, 1.5, right, their cost, so that's.
And they
And
give you a
it's as
10-year
long, it's,
I thought it goes below
it's
two, somebody
longevity of
told
it
me.
too.
10-year term,
10-year term.
a longer
Longer
for the life of the building.
50-year amortization.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's all good
it's
stuff.
good stuff. It's really good stuff.
It's just painful to go through the process. I think we should be worried about training trades. We used to have really good trades, and now this sort of apprenticeship union thing went away, and 5 guys show up, 2 of them have held a hammer before, and it's going to be really a bad outcome. And not everybody wants to be a university professor. And you can make a lot of money being a plumber or carpenter, and they're good jobs.
Better than
And
university
we have a lot of jobs coming up, and I'd like to see more people graduating with those trades.
Yeah, Josh, you
Really-
study labor markets. You know,
Yeah.
why aren't,
We may
I've
agree on
heard this,
something.
right? Like, how come these kids sit around in their parents' basement and play video games instead of learning to be a plumber?
That's a good question. We have an interesting training system in Canada. We don't have great vocational training. I would just say that when you're building 45,000 units, you're going to be drawing from sometimes the margins of the labor market in a sense. So that's kind of going to happen when you're building at kind of double the rate that you historically have. On Calgary, it fluctuates a lot more, and if you actually look at, and one of the slides I had up there, but I didn't get to it, I spared you, is that if you look at the kind of the equilibrium vacancy rate where nominal rents kind of increase at about inflation, about 2%. Vancouver, for whatever reason, it's an interesting empirical question, has a lower equilibrium rate, so about 1.75 to 2% vacancy rate is where kind of rents just increase by about 2%, whereas Calgary and Edmonton is significantly higher, and Toronto's somewhere in between, so it just suggests that you have slightly different rental markets.
All right, last question, and then we're going to wrap it up, but an oddball one from the audience, but I liked it. How many people should live in Vancouver? And you can take a number, or you can take a annual rate of growth. How do we know when we don't have enough housing? When do we have enough housing?
I remember reading something a couple of years ago that an economist said that Canada needs 100 million people to basically, be a country of, some real viability and strength, and to control our destiny more. So, I don't know. We take our share here, I guess. I think 100 million people in Canada would be a good thing.
How many more people?
Well, I don't know. I don't look at that kind of stuff, but it's a great place to live. Every time I go somewhere else, I love coming home. So it's a beautiful place. So let's keep it beautiful, and let's keep it happy and mix of people living here.
Khelsilem, thoughts? Obviously, there's been some population growth adverse to Squamish.
There's been a little bit, starting in 1911 when the train opened up here. My thought on that is, I don't have a number or a percentage or anything like that because I think it fluctuates. But I support Canada and Vancouver being a welcoming city, especially in the context of refugees and immigrants and things like that. And the reality is that on this coast, when newcomers arrived here back in 1781 and then again in 1823 and then throughout, the local Indigenous people are actually quite welcoming in this part of the world, right? But I do think that part of the conversation as well on the amount of housing we built, type of housing we built, type of communities we build, is relative to a few things for me. One of them is really thinking about how a lot of this also has to deal with the climate crisis and the climate emergency and the type of communities we built around that. And the potential, as we've seen with Syria in the last decade, around climate refugees, and the role that Canada, as a history of welcoming refugees, and the role that our cities play in terms of welcoming people when they're fleeing different types of circumstances around the world. Vancouver's a very hospitable place in terms of climate and crime and all these types of things. And as the world starts to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis, I think we know that there's going to be more climate refugees. And I think Vancouver needs to position itself as a part of that value around welcoming those who need help. I think that's going to be an important part of the conversation. What happens when there's billions and billions and billions of refugees and countries are saying, what are we going to do about it? And is Vancouver, given its history, is it going to open its borders or is it going to close? And I think that's, to the housing question, I think that's important.
Josh, I'll leave it, last question to you with an attempt. You've done a great job, but a little bit of a zinger one here, if I may. So rental housing doesn't sit empty in Vancouver. So it's either going to bring down prices for locals because for a fixed population, you're going to lower rents, but maybe not. Maybe it's housing for outsiders. So where do we draw the line and say, we want lower rents, we don't want people coming in and moving from the countries where the climate's no good to opportunity that Vancouver has a history of providing immigrants like myself. So when do we say enough is enough with this immigration, let's close our door?
You want me to answer that question? It's a dangerous question.
It's all about security of tenure.
It depends on what kind of society you want to have. I think fundamentally immigration reshapes societies. And there are many things that come with that are positive, and there are tensions that emerge. And rising populism is not something to take lightly. And I think we do so at our peril. And so we need to be judicious with how we think about that as a country that has, generally speaking, done things pretty well so far.
Fantastic. Panelists, thank you so much. David, Tony, Khelsilem, and Josh. And as a parent of teenage boys, I would like to say, great behavior on the part of the audience, some very good questions passed up. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for coming and supporting the center. We really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you.
Josh, nice to meet you.